The morning of November 20th, 1943, off the coast of Betio Island in the Tarawa atoll, something impossible began to emerge from the Pacific surf. Japanese machine gunners, positioned behind concrete bunkers and carefully sighted along predetermined kill zones, watched in disbelief as steel monsters crawled out of the ocean itself. These weren't boats that stopped at the reef, forcing enemy troops to wade helplessly through waist-deep water. These were tracked vehicles, grinding over coral barriers as if the natural defenses of the atoll meant nothing, depositing American Marines directly onto defended beaches with their weapons dry and their formations intact. The Japanese had spent months preparing for the American assault on Tarawa. They had studied every amphibious operation the Allies had conducted. They understood how naval invasions worked. Ships would bombard, landing craft would approach. The coral reef surrounding Betio, extending 500 to 800 yards from shore, would stop the boats. And then, Japanese defenders would slaughter the Americans as they waded through the lagoon, exposed and vulnerable, exactly as defensive doctrine predicted. Except none of that happened. Because the Americans brought something the Japanese had never imagined, let alone prepared to counter. Machines that transformed the ocean from a barrier into a highway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The LVT, or Landing Vehicle Tract, nicknamed the Amtrak by Marines who rode inside them, represented a fundamental shift in how amphibious warfare could be conducted. But this revolutionary weapon of war didn't begin as a weapon at all. Its origins traced back to the swamps of Florida, to devastating hurricanes, to rescue missions that never happened, and to one eccentric millionaire engineer who wanted nothing more than to save lives. The fact that his invention would instead become the instrument that saved thousands of Marines while taking thousands of Japanese lives was an irony that Donald Roebling never fully embraced. The story begins not in 1941 when America entered the war, but in 1935, in the aftermath of one of Florida's most catastrophic natural disasters. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 remains the most intense tropical cyclone ever to make landfall in the United States, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and storm surges reaching 18 to 20 feet. The hurricane devastated the Florida Keys, and as rescue workers attempted to reach stranded survivors in flooded, marshy areas, they discovered a brutal truth. Boats couldn't navigate the shallow waters choked with vegetation and debris. Trucks and cars drowned in water barely 3 feet deep. People died not from the storm itself, but because rescuers simply couldn't reach them in time. Donald Roebling witnessed this tragedy from his estate in Clearwater. He was 32 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and tormented by a legacy he couldn't escape. His great-grandfather, John Augustus Roebling, had designed the Brooklyn Bridge. His grandfather, Colonel Washington Roebling, had overseen its construction while battling decompression sickness that left him partially paralyzed. His grandmother, Emily Warren Roebling, had essentially become the project's chief engineer when her husband could no longer leave their home. The Roebling name meant genius, determination, and engineering marvels that redefined what was possible. Donald had fled to Florida to escape that crushing weight of expectation, seeking anonymity in a place where he could tinker and invent without the burden of family comparison. But his father, John Roebling II, saw the hurricane's devastation as an opportunity to challenge his son. The conversation, as Roebling later recounted, was simple and direct. "Donald, people are drowning in areas where boats can't go and cars can't reach. Use your engineering talents to design a vehicle that bridges the gap between where a boat is grounded and a car is flooded out." It was precisely the kind of problem that required innovative thinking rather than traditional solutions, and Donald Roebling, despite his desire to avoid the spotlight, possessed the one quality his famous ancestors had embodied: an inability to walk away from an engineering challenge that could save lives. Roebling retreated to his private workshop in Clearwater and began sketching. The solution he envisioned was radical. Instead of designing a vehicle optimized for either land or water, he would create something that operated in both environments simultaneously. Traditional thinking dictated that you needed wheels for land, propellers for water, and some mechanism to transition between the two. Roebling threw out those assumptions entirely. His design featured continuous tracks, similar to those on agricultural tractors, but fitted with curved cleats that would grip mud on land while acting as paddle wheels in water. The hull would be aluminum, not steel, to minimize weight and maximize buoyancy, and the entire contraption would be powered by a single engine driving those tracks, eliminating the complexity of dual propulsion systems. The first alligator, as Roebling named it, rolled out of his workshop in early 1935. It was ungainly, loud, and frankly bizarre in appearance. 24 feet long and nearly 10 feet wide, the vehicle resembled nothing so much as a metal bathtub fitted with tank treads. Powered by a 92-horsepower Chrysler industrial engine, it weighed over 14,000 pounds. When Roebling fired up the engine and sent his creation across the scrub palmetto fields surrounding his estate, it achieved a respectable land speed of 25 miles per hour. But when he drove it into the water for its first swim test, disappointment set in immediately. The alligator crawled through the water at barely 2 miles per hour, and the tracks broke after only a few miles of operation. Most inventors would have abandoned the project or declared the concept fundamentally flawed. Roebling instead saw the failure as data. He rebuilt the alligator, experimenting with different track patterns, cleat angles, and weight distributions. By 1937, after 4 complete redesigns, he had created a vehicle that weighed only 8,700 pounds, achieved water speeds of 8.6 miles per hour, and maintained land speeds approaching 20 miles per hour. The key innovation was the curved diagonal cleats attached to the tracks. Unlike the straight horizontal cleats of his first design, these curved cleats caught water at an angle, creating more efficient propulsion while still providing excellent grip on muddy terrain. Patented this design in 1938, and it would become the foundation for every landing vehicle tract built during World War II. But Roebling's alligator remained a curiosity, a strange machine occasionally demonstrated at local events in Florida, but with no practical application beyond rescue work that, fortunately, wasn't needed. The vehicle might have disappeared entirely into obscurity if not for one magazine article and one naval officer who happened to read it at precisely the right moment. On October 4th, 1937, Life magazine published a photo essay showcasing Roebling's amphibious vehicle. The article, filled with enthusiastic praise and dramatic photographs of the alligator churning through swamps, caught the attention of Rear Admiral Edward Kalbfuss, commander of battleships for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Kalbfuss understood something that most naval officers in 1937 were only beginning to grasp. The next war in the Pacific would be unlike any conflict in history. It wouldn't be fought in open ocean battles between fleets of dreadnoughts, though those would certainly occur. Instead, the decisive campaigns would happen on islands. Tiny coral atolls scattered across millions of square miles of ocean, each one potentially fortified, each one requiring an amphibious assault to capture. And the United States Marine Corps, which had been developing amphibious warfare doctrine for nearly 2 decades, faced an unsolvable problem. How do you land troops on beaches protected by coral reefs that extend hundreds of yards from shore? The Marines had studied this challenge extensively. They understood the tactical nightmare that coral reefs presented. Conventional landing craft like the LVT, the Higgins boat that would become synonymous with D-Day at Normandy, required at least 3 feet of water depth to operate. But coral reefs created irregular underwater barriers where depths could vary from 6 inches to 6 feet within a distance of 20 yards. A landing craft might successfully navigate to within 500 yards of shore and then suddenly ground on a coral head rising within a foot of the surface. At that point, troops would have to disembark and wade through chest-deep water, carrying 70-pound combat loads, while Japanese machine guns swept predetermined fire lanes. The Marines had calculated that such tactics could result in casualty rates exceeding 50% before a single man reached dry sand. Admiral Kalbfuss brought the Life magazine article to Major General Louis McCarty Little, commanding general of the Fleet Marine Force. General Little immediately recognized the potential. Roebling's amphibious tractor could, in theory, solve the reef problem entirely. Its tracks could carry it over coral barriers. Its buoyancy would allow it to operate in shallow water where boats grounded. And if properly modified, it could transport fully equipped Marines directly from ship to shore across any reef and deposit them on the beach with their weapons ready to fight. General Little forwarded the article up the chain of command to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and by March 1938, Major John Kaloof of the Equipment Board at Quantico, Virginia, was dispatched to Clearwater with orders to investigate whether Roebling's strange machine could be adapted for military use. Major Kaloof spent several days with Roebling, examining the alligator, testing it in various conditions, and discussing potential modifications. His report back to Quantico was enthusiastic but highlighted several concerns. The alligator's aluminum hull, while lightweight, wouldn't withstand combat conditions. The carrying capacity was insufficient for a full platoon of Marines, and Roebling himself seemed ambivalent about military applications. He had designed the vehicle for rescue work, for saving lives, not for warfare. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. They were asking a humanitarian inventor to help them build a weapon. The Marine Corps formally requested that the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair purchase a pilot model for further testing. The request was denied. Funding was limited, and the Bureau didn't see sufficient merit in what appeared to be an experimental and unproven concept. For nearly 2 years, the project languished. Marine Corps officers who had seen the alligator's potential pressed for reconsideration, but without funding, nothing could move forward. It wasn't until the fall of 1938, when Brigadier General Emil Moses, president of the Marine Corps Equipment Board, personally visited Roebling in Clearwater, that momentum returned. General Moses was blunt. War was coming, probably soon, and certainly in the Pacific. The Marines needed Roebling's vehicle, but they needed it stronger, faster, more seaworthy, and capable of carrying combat loads. Could Roebling design such a machine? Roebling agreed, but on one condition. The Marine Corps had no available funding, so Roebling would finance the project himself. Over the next 18 months, Roebling invested $18,000 of his own money, an enormous sum in 1939, to build what he called the Alligator III. This new model incorporated everything the Marines had requested. It was larger, more robust, and powered by a more powerful engine. When completed in May 1940, the Alligator III weighed 7,700 pounds, could carry an additional 7,000 pounds of cargo, or troops, and achieved speeds of 29 miles per hour on land and over 9 miles per hour in water. The Navy finally found $24,000 to fund the project formally, and in November 1940, the Alligator III underwent extensive testing at Quantico and later during fleet exercises in the Caribbean. The results exceeded expectations. The vehicle performed reliably in rough surf, climbed over obstacles that would have stopped any wheeled vehicle, and demonstrated the ability to carry 24 fully equipped Marines from ship to shore in conditions where conventional landing craft simply couldn't operate. The testing did reveal weaknesses. The aluminum hull, even with improved construction, was too fragile. Maintenance was more complex than anticipated, and the vehicle's tracks, while revolutionary, wore out quickly on hard surfaces like concrete or packed sand. But the fundamental concept was proven. An amphibious tracked vehicle could solve the reef problem. In February 1941, the Navy awarded a contract for 200 production models, designated LVT-1, to be built with welded steel construction for durability and ease of manufacturing. Roebling subcontracted the actual production to the Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, which operated a plant in Dunedin, Florida. FMC normally manufactured agricultural equipment, citrus spray pumps, and food processing machinery. Converting their facility to build amphibious military vehicles represented a significant industrial challenge, but by July 1941, the first production LVT-1 rolled off the assembly line. The timing was almost uncanny. 4 months later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. The Marines now had a revolutionary amphibious vehicle, but only 200 of them, and most Marine Corps officers had never seen one operate. The 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion was formed in February 1942 at Dunedin, equipped with the first production LVTs. A 2nd battalion followed in March. Training was rushed, maintenance procedures were improvised, and doctrinal questions about how to employ these strange vehicles in combat remained largely unanswered. The Marines would have to learn those lessons in battle. The LVT-1 that emerged from FMC's factory was a far cry from Roebling's original rescue vehicle, though. The core concept remained unchanged. Built from welded steel plates, it measured 21 feet long and nearly 10 feet wide. The front section housed a 2-man crew compartment with minimal armor protection, essentially just the thickness of the hull itself. Behind the crew compartment sat a large open cargo well, 21 feet by 10 feet, capable of carrying 18 to 24 fully equipped Marines or 4,500 pounds of supplies. The vehicle was powered by a Hercules 6-cylinder gasoline engine, producing 146 horsepower, mounted in a housing within the cargo area. This engine drove Roebling's patented track system, which featured curved cleats that provided propulsion both on land and in water. Performance specifications were modest but adequate. On land, the LVT-1 could reach speeds of 18 miles per hour on flat terrain, though this dropped significantly on sand or rough ground. In water, it achieved 4 knots, roughly 4.6 miles per hour, which was slower than most landing craft but sufficient for ship-to-shore operations. The vehicle's most important characteristic wasn't speed, but versatility. It could transition from water to land without stopping, climb over obstacles up to 3 feet high, and operate in water depths ranging from 10 feet to 18 inches. This meant it could cross coral reefs that would strand every other landing craft in the American inventory. Armament was minimal on the early LVT-1 second. Most carried 2 .30 caliber Browning M 1,919 machine guns mounted on the sides of the cargo well, operated by the Marines riding inside. Some vehicles received upgrades before Tarawa, adding 2 .50 caliber Browning M, 2 heavy machine guns mounted forward for more punch against hardened targets. But the LVT-1 was never intended to be a fighting vehicle. It was a tractor, an amphibious cargo carrier designed to move supplies from ship to shore. The fact that the Marines would soon be using it to deliver assault troops directly into enemy fire was a battlefield adaptation born of desperate necessity. The first operational use of LVTs came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The 1st Marine Division brought approximately 128 LVT-1 second to the Solomon Islands campaign. But in this initial deployment, the vehicles were used exclusively for logistics, ferrying supplies from transport ships to the beach and occasionally evacuating wounded. They didn't participate in the actual amphibious assault. The landing at Guadalcanal faced minimal opposition on the beaches, and conventional Higgins boats worked adequately for the initial waves. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious task force, was frankly unimpressed with the LVTs. He considered them mechanically unreliable, difficult to maintain, and of limited utility compared to proven landing craft. But Major General Holland M. Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, saw something different. Smith, nicknamed Howlin' Mad for his volcanic temper and uncompromising standards, had been present during the LVT trials at Quantico and in the Caribbean. He understood the vehicle's potential, even if its first operational deployment hadn't showcased those capabilities. Smith believed amphibious tractors could revolutionize ship-to-shore movement, and he advocated strongly for continued development and expanded production. His advocacy would prove prescient, because by late 1943, American forces were preparing to assault an island where conventional landing craft would face exactly the nightmare scenario the Marines had long feared. That island was Tarawa. Betio Island, the main objective within Tarawa Atoll, was barely 2 miles long and nowhere more than 800 yards wide. A sliver of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific that should have been strategically insignificant. But geography and timing had transformed this tiny speck into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Japanese Empire. By November 1943, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded approximately 4,500 Japanese troops dug into an elaborate network of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and interconnected defensive positions. Shibasaki had boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. The Americans were about to test that claim with 18,000 Marines, massive naval support, and 75 LVT-1 second alongside 50 of the newer LVT-2 water buffalo models. The Japanese defensive plan was straightforward and, based on all historical precedent, entirely sound. Tarawa's lagoon was ringed by a coral reef extending 500 to 800 yards from shore. At high tide, the water over the reef might reach 4 or 5 feet, enough for landing craft to cross. At low tide, the water depth dropped to 18 inches or less in many places. The Japanese had carefully calculated tide tables and positioned their artillery and machine guns to cover every yard of the lagoon between reef and shore. Their doctrine assumed American landing craft would either wait for high tide, giving defenders time to prepare, or attempt to cross at lower water levels and run aground. Either way, American troops would have to disembark from stranded boats and wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water, while Japanese gunners swept pre-sighted kill zones. It was, from the Japanese perspective, a perfect defensive arrangement. What Shibasaki and his staff couldn't have known, was that American intelligence had identified this exact vulnerability and planned specifically to counter it. The 2nd Marine Division, under Major General Julian Smith, would rely heavily on amphibious tractors to deliver the first 3 waves directly across the reef and onto the beach. Conventional Higgins boats would follow with subsequent waves, but only after the LVTs had secured a foothold. It was a bold plan that represented a fundamental departure from standard amphibious doctrine, which called for massive simultaneous landings to overwhelm defences with sheer numbers. Instead, the Marines would land in staggered waves, accepting less initial combat power on the beach in exchange for getting troops there alive and combat effective. The assault began before dawn on November 20th, 1943. Naval bombardment commenced at 6:30 a.m., with 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, and multiple destroyers hammering Betio with thousands of shells. Carrier aircraft from the escort carriers added bombs and strafing runs. The island disappeared beneath towering columns of smoke and dust. American planners hoped this unprecedented firepower would neutralize Japanese defenses, or at least stun them sufficiently to allow the initial waves to establish positions before enemy fire could reorganize. The bombardment lasted 2.5 hours, expending more ordnance than had been used in many entire Pacific campaigns up to that point. At 9 a.m., the first wave of LVT-1 second crossed the line of departure and began their run toward the reef. Each Amtrak carried approximately 20 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, along with the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. The vehicles formed into organized waves, engines roaring, tracks churning white foam in the blue Pacific water. From a distance, the sight was almost absurd. These boxy, ungainly machines looked nothing like the sleek landing craft or powerful warships surrounding them. They resembled floating tractors, which is precisely what they were. But as they approached the reef line, 800 yards from shore, something extraordinary happened. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The LVTs didn't stop. Conventional landing craft, hitting the reef at this point, would have grounded immediately, their flat bottoms scraping coral, propellers churning uselessly in shallow water. The LVTs simply climbed. Their tracked drive systems, those curved cleats that Roebling had perfected through years of experimentation, gripped the coral and pulled the vehicles forward and upward. Water depth dropped from 6 feet to 3 feet to 18 inches, and still the Amtraks kept moving. They waddled, lurched, and ground their way across the reef shelf, crossing the barrier that Japanese planners had assumed would stop any assault vehicle. Japanese defenders watched in stunned disbelief. One officer, later captured by American forces, described the moment as seeing iron spiders crawl out of the sea. Another account, found in a diary recovered from Betio, described the vehicles as impossible things that moved like turtles from the water. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese troops had trained for months to defend against amphibious landings. They understood doctrine, tactics, and the expected sequence of an American assault. Ships would bombard, aircraft would strafe, landing craft would approach the reef and stop, infantry would disembark into the lagoon. And at that moment, when American forces were most vulnerable, Japanese guns would open fire and create a massacre. Every element of this defensive plan depended on that critical moment when attackers would be trapped between reef and shore, exposed in open water. The LVTs eliminated that moment entirely. By the time Japanese gunners fully registered what was happening, the first Amtraks were already across the reef and grinding through the shallower lagoon waters toward the beach. Defensive fire, which should have begun when landing craft grounded on the reef, instead opened up when the tracked vehicles were already within 300 yards of shore. Machine gun positions that had pre-sighted their fire lanes for targets wading through deep water found themselves shooting at moving vehicles protected by steel hulls. Artillery crews, expecting to shell concentrated groups of infantry trapped in the lagoon, instead faced dispersed targets that kept advancing despite hits. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first LVT-1 hit Red Beach 2 at approximately 9:22 a.m., grinding up onto the coral sand with its engine screaming and tracks throwing up spray. The ramp, a simple steel plate that dropped from the rear, fell open and 22 Marines poured out directly onto Betio Island. They weren't wet. They weren't exhausted from wading hundreds of yards under fire. Their weapons were dry, their ammunition intact, and they were combat-ready within seconds of reaching shore. A seawall, roughly 3 feet high and constructed from coconut logs and coral, provided immediate cover. The Marines from this first tractor moved inland quickly, establishing a foothold before Japanese defenders could concentrate fire. But not all Amtraks were so fortunate. Of the 42 LVTs in the first 3 waves, 8 were destroyed before reaching the beach. Japanese artillery, recovering from the initial shock, began scoring direct hits. The thin steel hulls of the LVT-1 second, never designed to withstand anti-tank fire or heavy artillery, offered minimal protection. When a 75mm shell struck an Amtrak, the results were catastrophic. The vehicle would shudder, smoke would pour from the cargo well, and often the entire machine would explode as gasoline ignited. Marines riding inside had virtually no chance of survival when their vehicle took a direct hit. Those who did survive the initial impact found themselves thrown into the lagoon, often wounded, weighed down by equipment, and under continuous fire. Private Don Crane, driver of LVT number 41, experienced this nightmare firsthand. His Amtrak took a direct hit from Japanese artillery approximately 300 yards from shore. The explosion killed his radio operator instantly and wounded his assistant driver. The vehicle's engine died, and water began flooding into the cargo well through holes torn in the hull. Crane, miraculously uninjured, found himself in a sinking tractor with 23 Marines, most of them wounded or stunned. He managed to get 3 men out alive, including himself, before the vehicle slipped beneath the surface. Crane then spent the next several hours in the lagoon, keeping 2 wounded Marines alive until darkness allowed him to swim them to the seawall. His story was repeated in variations across all 3 assault beaches. The LVTs had gotten men closer to shore than any previous landing, but they weren't invincible, and when they failed, the results were just as deadly as the wade from grounded landing craft. The real disaster came with the 4th, 5th, and 6th waves. The Marines had only enough LVTs to deliver the first 3 waves, perhaps 1,200 men total. Every subsequent wave had to use conventional Higgins boats, and those boats, as predicted, grounded on the reef exactly as Japanese defensive planning had anticipated. The difference was that by the time these later waves approached, Japanese defenders were fully alert, and their fire was organized and devastating. Marines leaping over the sides of grounded Higgins boats found themselves in waist-deep to chest-deep water, 500 yards from shore, with no cover except the bodies of men who had already been killed. The water in Tarawa's lagoon literally turned red. Survivors described being able to feel the current of blood as it moved through the water. Machine gun fire created fountains of spray as rounds impacted all around struggling Marines. Some men tried to use coral heads as cover, crouching behind formations barely large enough to hide behind. Others attempted to push disabled landing craft ahead of them as improvised shields. Many simply drowned, weighted down by 70-pound combat loads and unable to stay afloat when wounded. The wade from reef to shore, which should have taken perhaps 15 minutes under ideal conditions, became an hours-long ordeal for those who survived. Some Marines didn't reach the seawall until after dark, having spent the entire day crawling, swimming, and fighting through that lethal zone. The battle for Tarawa raged for 76 hours. By the time Admiral Shibasaki's garrison was annihilated, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered 1,009 killed and 2,101 wounded. Nearly 33% of the assault force became casualties, but analysis of where and when those casualties occurred revealed a stark pattern. The Marines delivered by LVT in the first 3 waves suffered far lower casualty rates during the landing phase than troops who arrived by Higgins boat in later waves. Of the approximately 1,200 men delivered by Amtrak, roughly, 150 became casualties during the actual landing, a rate of 12.5%. Of the men who had to wade from grounded Higgins boats, casualty rates during the landing phase exceeded 60%. The LVTs, despite their vulnerabilities, had proven that amphibious tracked vehicles could dramatically reduce casualties during the most dangerous phase of an assault. For the Japanese defenders, Tarawa represented more than a tactical defeat. It shattered fundamental assumptions about how amphibious warfare would unfold in the Pacific. Japanese military planners had studied American operations at Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands. They understood American capabilities in terms of naval power, air support, and infantry tactics, but they had no intelligence suggesting Americans possessed vehicles that could cross coral reefs while carrying assault troops. The surprise was complete. After Tarawa, Japanese intelligence reports reaching Tokyo included urgent warnings about American amphibious tractors. One assessment described them as a decisive technical advantage that Japanese forces could not counter with existing weapons or tactics. The captured diary of a Japanese artillery officer stationed on Betio provided insight into the psychological impact. The officer wrote that when the tracked vehicles appeared, climbing over the reef, many defenders believed they were watching American tanks somehow swimming through the ocean. The confusion lasted only minutes before gunners began engaging the vehicles, but those critical minutes allowed the first LVTs to reach the beach with minimal losses. The officer noted that Japanese defensive fire plans assumed attackers would be on foot, exposed, and moving slowly through deep water. The Amtraks moved faster, presented smaller targets, and reached shore before concentrated fire could be organized. He concluded that future defensive positions must account for vehicles that can attack directly from the sea, though he had no suggestions for how to accomplish this. Japanese defensive doctrine began evolving immediately after Tarawa. At subsequent battles on Kwajalein, Saipan, and later islands, Japanese forces dug tank traps along beaches, positioned anti-tank weapons to cover likely landing zones, and moved more defensive positions inland, rather than concentrating them at the waterline. These adaptations acknowledged that coral reefs could no longer be relied upon as barriers. If Americans could bring tracked vehicles across reefs, then the beach itself became the new killing zone, and defenses had to adjust accordingly. But these improvisations were reactive and incomplete. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to develop their own amphibious tracked vehicles and their anti-tank weapons, designed primarily to counter American Sherman tanks, were relatively ineffective against the smaller, more dispersed targets that LVTs presented. The American response to Tarawa was swift and comprehensive. Holland Smith, promoted to Lieutenant General and commanding all Marine Corps forces in the Central Pacific, declared that every future landing would be spearheaded by amphibious vehicles. No more would Marines be asked to wade through exposed lagoons under fire. The procurement of LVTs received highest priority. Production, which had been running at modest levels, ramped up dramatically. By early 1944, factories were producing 500 LVTs per month. Smith recommended that each Marine division be equipped with 2 battalions of cargo LVTs and 1 battalion of armed LVT variants capable of providing direct fire support. The immediate lesson was that the LVT-1, while revolutionary, was inadequate for combat assault. Its thin hull provided almost no protection. Its open cargo well exposed troops to artillery airbursts and plunging fire, and its lack of armament meant it couldn't suppress enemy positions during the approach. Engineers and Marine Corps tacticians worked urgently to address these shortcomings. The result was a rapid evolution of LVT designs, each incorporating lessons learned from actual combat. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo, already in limited production by Tarawa, became the immediate replacement for the LVT-1. The Water Buffalo featured a more powerful Continental radial engine borrowed from the M3 Stuart light tank, producing 250 horsepower compared to the LVT-1's 146. This increased power allowed the vehicle to carry heavier loads and move faster in water, achieving speeds of 7 miles per hour. The suspension system was upgraded with a rubber torsion system that improved performance on land, reducing the bone-rattling ride that made earlier models so uncomfortable. The cargo capacity increased to 9,000 pounds, allowing the vehicle to carry not just troops but also light artillery, mortars, and substantial quantities of ammunition. But the most significant development was the LVTA-1, the first armoured amphibious tractor designed specifically for fire support. Based on the LVT-2 chassis, the A1 variant featured 12 mm of armour plate on the bow, crew cabin, and turret, with 6 mm elsewhere. More importantly, it mounted a turret nearly identical to that of the M3 Stuart light tank, armed with a 37 mm gun and coaxial 30 caliber machine gun. 2. Additional 30 caliber machine guns on ring mounts behind the turret provided anti-aircraft and anti-personnel coverage. The LVTA-1 weighed considerably more than the cargo versions, and its combat load was limited to crew and ammunition rather than infantry. But its purpose wasn't to deliver troops. It was to lead assault waves, suppressing enemy positions with direct fire while cargo LVTs followed behind. 509 LVTA-1 second were produced, and they first saw combat at the invasion of Kwajalein Atoll in February 1944. The tactical employment was revelatory. Armoured Amtraks would form the first wave, approaching the beach ahead of cargo-carrying LVTs. As they crossed the reef and entered the lagoon, the Amtank crews would engage visible bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions with their 37 mm guns. The suppressive fire forced Japanese defenders to take cover, rather than concentrating fire on the vulnerable cargo tractors following minutes behind. It wasn't perfect. The 37 mm gun, adequate against many targets, struggled to penetrate the heaviest Japanese fortifications. But it was enough to disrupt defensive fire during the critical minutes when cargo LVTs were most exposed. The LVT-4, introduced in mid-1944 and first used at Saipan, represented the most significant redesign of the entire series. Engineers relocated the engine from the cargo well to a position immediately behind the crew cabin. This seemingly simple change allowed for the installation of a rear ramp, transforming how troops disembarked. Earlier LVTs required Marines to climb over the sides of the vehicle, exposing themselves to fire and taking precious seconds. The LVT-4's rear ramp dropped quickly, allowing an entire squad to exit in seconds, moving directly into cover. The tactical advantage was enormous. Time spent disembarking was time spent under fire, and anything that reduced that time saved lives. The LVT-4 was larger than previous models, measuring 26 feet long and weighing over 18 tons when fully loaded. Its Continental W6709, a radial engine, another piece borrowed from aircraft and tank production, generated 250 horsepower and provided reliable performance even in harsh conditions. The vehicle could carry 24 fully equipped Marines, or approximately 8,000 pounds of cargo. Standard armament included 2 50-caliber Browning machine guns and 2 30-caliber machine guns, though field modifications often varied this and configuration based on mission requirements. Nearly 8,500 LVT-4 seconds were produced by war's end, making it the most numerous variant of the entire series. The LVT-A-4, the fire support version based on the LVT-4 chassis, mounted a 75mm howitzer in an open-topped turret. This was the same gun used on the M8 howitzer motor carriage, and it provided devastating firepower against fortified positions. A 75mm high-explosive shell could collapse bunkers, destroy machine gun nests, and neutralize artillery positions at ranges up to a mile. The AmTank variant carried a crew of 6: driver, assistant driver, commander, gunner, loader, and radio operator. With limited space for ammunition, typically only 100 rounds, the LVT-A-4 would fire primarily during the approach and initial landing phase, then withdraw to reload from supply vessels offshore. By June 1944, when American forces assaulted Saipan in the Mariana Islands, nearly 700 LVTs participated in the operation. This included cargo variants, armored fire support vehicles, and specialized command and control tractors fitted with additional radios. The landing at Saipan showcased how dramatically amphibious doctrine had evolved in just 7 months since Tarawa. The first wave consisted entirely of LVT-A-4 AmTanks, 30 vehicles mounting 75mm howitzers. They crossed the reef line and began engaging Japanese positions at extreme range, firing while still in the water. The second and third waves, cargo LVTs carrying infantry, followed 3 minutes behind, using the suppressive fire to close with minimal casualties. Subsequent waves continued at regular intervals, each timed to arrive as previous waves cleared the beach. Japanese defenders on Saipan had prepared specifically for amphibious tractors. They dug tank traps, laid minefields along likely landing beaches, and positioned anti-tank guns to cover the approaches. These measures caused significant LVT losses. Dozens of Amtraks were destroyed or disabled by direct hits, mines, or mechanical failures, but the sheer scale of the assault overwhelmed defensive positions. When one LVT was knocked out, 3 more appeared behind it. Japanese gunners, trained to engage individual targets, found themselves facing mechanical waves that never stopped coming. The psychological effect was crushing. Defenders described feeling that no amount of resistance could stop the iron tide flowing from the sea. The invasion of Guam in July 1944 saw over 500 LVTs employed, including significant numbers of the new LVT-4 with its rear ramp. Tinian, assaulted later that same month, used LVTs to execute one of the most innovative landings of the Pacific War. Rather than attacking the heavily defended beaches Japanese forces expected, American planners identified 2 narrow beaches on Tinian's northwest coast, each barely 60 yards wide, and backed by steep cliffs. Japanese commanders considered these beaches impossible landing sites, too narrow and restricted for major operations. They concentrated defenses elsewhere. The Americans landed there anyway, using LVTs in single-file assault. 1 tractor at a time would cross the reef, navigate through the narrow channel between coral heads, and discharge troops on the tiny beach. It was agonizingly slow. Landing a full regiment took over 6 hours, but casualties during the landing phase numbered fewer than 20 killed, because Japanese forces had positioned minimal defenses at what they considered impossible terrain. The LVT's ability to operate in restricted areas where conventional landing craft couldn't maneuver had opened tactical options that fundamentally changed how amphibious operations could be planned. Peleliu in September 1944 tested the LVT under the worst possible conditions. The island's beaches were covered in sharp coral ridges that tore tracks apart. Japanese defenders, learning from previous battles, had positioned their strongest defences inland rather than at the waterline, allowing LVTs to land relatively unopposed before hitting the assault force with artillery and mortar fire from elevated positions. The battle became a grinding nightmare that lasted over 2 months and cost nearly 2,000 American lives. But the landing itself, the critical phase that had caused such carnage at Tarawa, proceeded with relatively light casualties, precisely because LVTs could deliver troops directly onto the beach rather than forcing them to wade under fire. By early 1945, amphibious tractors had become so integrated into Marine Corps doctrine that planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa assumed their availability as standard equipment. At Iwo Jima in February, over 400 LVTs participated in the initial landing. The beaches were volcanic sand rather than coral-protected lagoons, but the vehicles still proved invaluable. They could traverse the soft sand that bogged down wheeled vehicles, continuing inland to deliver troops and supplies, while conventional trucks waited for engineers to build roads. At Okinawa in April, over 1,200 LVTs took part in the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The landing on April 1st was remarkably smooth, with fewer than 200 killed during the entire first day despite landing 60,000 troops. The Japanese had chosen to defend inland rather than at the beaches, but the speed and efficiency of the LVT-enabled landing meant American forces established their beachhead before Japanese counterattacks could be organized. The legacy of the LVT extended far beyond World War II. Its fundamental concept, that amphibious operations could employ armoured vehicles capable of operating in both water and on land, reshaped military thinking globally. The Marine Corps continued developing tracked amphibious vehicles through the Korean War, Vietnam, and into the modern era. Today's AAV-7A1, still in service with the Marines, traces its lineage directly back to Donald Roebling's Alligator. The vehicle has grown larger, more powerful, and more sophisticated, but the core principle remains unchanged. Tracks with cleats provide propulsion in water and on land, allowing seamless transition between environments. For Donald Roebling, the war brought recognition he never sought. In December 1948, President Harry Truman awarded him the Medal of Merit, acknowledging that his invention had contributed directly to Allied victory in the Pacific. The citation noted that Roebling's amphibian tractor had broken trails through jungles, formed pontoons for temporary bridges, and most importantly, moved troops and equipment to otherwise inaccessible locations under fire. Roebling accepted the honour quietly. He never spoke extensively about the military applications of his vehicle, preferring to remember it as a rescue device that had, through circumstances beyond his control, become a weapon of war. Roebling died in August 1959, at 66 years old. By that time, the LVT had become part of military history, a footnote in amphibious warfare doctrine. But for the Japanese defenders who watched those impossible machines crawl out of the sea at Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, and a dozen other islands, the memory remained vivid. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers repeatedly cited the amphibious tractor as one of the most significant American technical advantages. One officer described them as machines that transformed the ocean from Japan's defensive ally into America's offensive highway. Another stated simply that once the tracked vehicles appeared, Japan's island defenses became obsolete overnight because the natural barriers that should have protected them meant nothing against an enemy who could drive across reefs as easily as roads. The LVT's impact on casualties was quantifiable. At Tarawa, where only a third of the assault force arrived by LVT, casualties during the landing phase exceeded 60% for troops delivered by conventional craft, but remained under 15% for those delivered by Amtrak. At Saipan, Tinian, and subsequent operations where LVTs delivered the majority of assault forces, landing phase casualties dropped to under 10%. Over the course of the Pacific War, this difference represented approximately 8,000 Marines who survived landings they statistically should not have. Those men came home, had families, built lives that the amphibious tractor made possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.